Hey guys, Miss Marflack here. The last time we were together, we graphed our parent function for tangent. We used a table of values, even though ours looked a little different than this one. We started at negative, I believe, pi, and we went all the way to pi, and then we were able to graph our parent function for tangent. When we graphed our parent function, we saw that we were kind of bounded between this negative pi over 2 and this pi over 2. That's where our asymptotes lied. And then we had our low point, our midpoint, and our high point. And then we talked about how we get really close to the asymptote. We flatten out a bit, but not a straight line. And then we get really close to the asymptote again. After that, we went through some characteristics of our tangent function. We talked about how the period is pi. We didn't go over domain and range, but we did talk about the vertical asymptotes being at those odd multiples of pi over 2. And then you can see here kind of multiple periods of pi. Multiple periods of our tangent graph, and one period is pi, I mean. And then we talked about how to graph. We looked at transformations with just A and B. In our formula, we do have our plus D here, which is our vertical shift. We start off by listing out our variables, finding our period, and then finding our starting point using this inequality. And then you can see our kind of picture over here, and that is the function that we're graphing with some transformations. So in the last video, we did A and B. Now in this video, you're going to see C and D. We're going to stick to graphing one period just for right now, and then I'll make another video where we're graphing two periods, and we'll have some negatives thrown in there as well. All right, here we are. Directions are going to be to graph one period, and we're going to graph y equals tangent. We're going to keep the A as 1, we're going to keep the B as 1, and then now we're going to have a C, and we're also going to have a D. All right, just like we did with our sine and cosine, we're going to start off by listing out all those variables. So A is 1, B is 1, C is positive pi over 4 because the minus sign is in the formula, and then D is a positive 1. Our period for tangent is pi over B, and B here is 1, so our period is just pi. Now it's time to find that phase shift, or where you start that first asymptote, and that's your Bx minus C on the inside. And then that's between what we know are our two asymptotes for our parent function, negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. Excuse me, this should be 4. All right, so that's coming from this formula here. All right, so now we have, we need to solve for that x on the inside, so we're going to add pi over 4. All right, but what we do here, we also have to do to each side of our compound inequality. So this plus pi over 4 will cancel with the minus pi over 4 on the inside, leaving us just with x, which is what we want. This is negative 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4. Well, that's negative pi over 4, just the x on the inside. And then 2 over 4 plus 1 over 4 is 3 over 4. And then that's going to be where our asymptotes are. All right, so we have our period, we have where our asymptotes are going to lie, where our domain is going to be in between, so we're going to now need our quarters, which is our full period divided by those 4 spaces. Even though we don't have 5 points, we still have 5 key, maybe you could say characteristics, because we have asymptote, point, 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 asymptote. There's still 4 spaces in between there. All right, and then it's time to solve for our midline. That's our y equals d. That's where our middle point of the tangent graph is going to go. Our high point, we're going to add our amplitude. And then our low point, we're going to subtract our amplitude. So now I'm looking at these two asymptotes, and I see I start at negative pi over 4, and then I go to 3 pi over 4, and my quarters is pi over 4. So the majority of my graph is going to be sitting to the right. So I do need a little space here on the left, and then the majority of my graph is on the right. I'm putting in that negative pi over 4. I'm adding my quarter. A lot of you guys have been skipping 0 as a point in some of the work you've been submitting to me this last week. All right, so here negative pi over 4 is my first asymptote. I add my quarter. My next point is at 0. Then if it helps, put the little 0 there. All right, and then my next point is pi over 4, and I keep adding my quarters. I'm at pi over 2, and then we should end up at our last asymptote when we add, and we do. Now it's time to put in our low line is here, our mid, and our high. So I'll put in 2 and I'll put in 1. All right, we're going to do our asymptotes now. You really should have arrows off to the ends, okay? I get kind of lazy with that along the way. And then keeping in mind the shape of our tangent function starts at low. So we're at one x value next to the asymptote. Next x value is mid. Next x value is high. And then knowing the shape of the function, we start at the asymptote, we curve, we curve, we curve, we curve, and we get really, really close to the asymptote again. And then there's our tangent function. All right, good time to pause the video. Make sure you have all this down because we are moving on to the next one. Okay, we're gonna graph here number 2, y equals tangent. Now we'll do a negative, so we'll do plus pi, and then we'll do minus 2. All right, still keeping that a and that b as 1. All right, here we are listing out all those variables again. A is 1, B is 1, and then now C is negative pi, opposite sign that's on the inside. D is negative 2. Our period is pi over B, and B here is 1, so we just have pi. And then now we're setting up those asymptotes, so that's negative pi over 2, and then everything that's on the inside plus x plus pi, and then our pi over 2 for our parent function. Now our goal is to solve for x, so we have to undo or do an inverse operation of anything in the middle, which means I need to subtract pi, which means I also need to subtract pi here and subtract pi here. That plus pi and that minus pi will combine to 0. And then now we can get a common denominator here. This is like minus 2 pi over 2, and a minus 1 is a minus 3 pi over 2. Then we have the x on the inside, and same thing, this is like a positive 1 minus a 2 pi over 2, and that's going to be negative pi over 2. And then just checking that distance again, from negative 3 pi over 2 to negative pi over 2 is a distance of pi, so that looks good. All right, now we can see that our next step is going to be our quarters. Taking that full period and dividing it by 4. Since, you know, it's just like the last example, since our b is 1, our period and our quarters is the same, and b is still 1 in this example. All right, now we're going to do that midline, which is our y equals d. We have that high point, that's going to be adding our amplitude, and then our low point, we're going to subtract that amplitude. And then I can see that my entire graph is happening to the left of the y-axis. So I'm just going to drop in this y-axis here, and then I need all of my points to the left. All right, I'm starting at negative 3 pi over 2. And I need to add my quarters, which is going to be pi over 4. So we're going to get a common denominator here. This is like negative 6 over 4. So when I add pi over 4, I get negative 5 over 4. And then when I add another pi over 4, I get negative 4 over 4, which is negative pi. And then I get negative 3 pi over 4. And then negative 2 over 4 is just negative pi over 2. All right, and then if you're really, if you're kind of like me and the spacing doesn't look great, and here I definitely should have more space, I can go ahead and I can throw in that zigzag or that break in the x-axis. All right, and then now I should have made this a little longer, but I'm going to go ahead and drop that in. We need points at negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. I'm going to write it on the other side, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, just so that doesn't interfere here with our vertical asymptotes. And here I am, I'm going to draw my first one. There's my vertical asymptote where my function's undefined, and there's my other vertical asymptote where my function's undefined. And then now it's a positive tangent function, so I start at my low, and then I go mid, and then I go high. And we get really close now. I kind of left off at the bottom of the page. That's okay though. You try to get some more space, but this will keep going down. And then there's our function. All right, check back in for another video because we're going to do 2 periods and we're also going to do some negatives.